Hello, my name is Julian Chambliss. I'm with the Department of English. I'm also one of the faculty involved with CEDAR, which is the Consortium for Research, Critical Diversity in Digital Age Research. It's an acronym. It's a work in progress. Part of the reason that I'm so happy to be here is because of CEDAR and its emphasis on thinking about digital humanities in a different way. That was one of the reasons that I thought when I first heard about Hilary Green's project that she'd be a perfect person to bring to MSU. So Hilary Green is Associate Professor of History in the Department of Gender and Race Studies at the University of Alabama. She earned her BA in History with a minor in Africana Studies and Pre-Healing Arts from Franklin and Marshall College. She earned her MA in History from Tufts University and her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research and teaching explore the intersection of race, class, and gender in African American history, the American Civil War, Reconstruction, Civil War memory, and the US in 19th century America and the Atlantic world. Her first book, Educational Reconstruction, African American Schools in the Urban South, was published in 1916 and published in 2016.
I thought that one.
Wow. And explores how African Americans and their white allies created, developed, and sustained a system of African American education during the transition from slavery to freedom. The reason that we're here today to talk about her work is because of the unique digital public humanities project called Hallowed Ground that she developed beginning in 2015. This project started with a comment from a student who said to her there was no slavery at the University of Alabama. Spurred on by this comment, she's created a multi-semester project that explored the legacy of slavery in the University of Alabama. And it's my great pleasure to welcome her here to MSU to talk about that project. Hilary Green.
And it helps that technology in me sometimes doesn't always work, so we're going to figure this out. So I want to thank everyone for coming out to this lecture and who have made this visit quite enjoyable thus far. I want to personally thank Julian Chambliss for making this event happen and the various co-sponsors, the Digital Humanities at MSU, CEDAR, MSU Department of English, and the MSU Africa and African American Studies. So I'm going to start off with that comment that I think changed everything. But Dr. Green, slavery did not exist on our campus. This comment raised by a male African-American junior at my second semester at the University of Alabama launched my research on the campus history of slavery, the enslaved experience, and its legacy. So since early spring 2015, he made that statement in late January 2015, so I was in the archives that February. I have developed an alternate campus tour, conducted in-person guest lectures, and presentations to now over 3,500 individuals. I'm approaching 4,000. Developed an accessible cell phone, iPad-friendly, computer-friendly Adobe Spark version of that tour to increase accessibility, and I'll show parts of that today. And developed a very specific DH presence on my UA website. And I'm currently working on several publications exploring the history of the slave cemetery on our campus, 3 enslaved drummers, who I'll talk about later, and an enslaved carpenter who worked at the university for over 3 decades. And for me, this casual comment started a side project that keeps on growing. And this work was done all without an official university commission. In addition to my normal teaching load, my normal service load, and research on the African American experience over the Civil War and Reconstruction era. And in fact, when I started this work, I was finishing up my first book. So I was in the process of wrapping up that project while starting a new project. And my next book is on African American memory of the Civil War because of this comment and others. So it has shaped me in many ways. In other words, the Hallowed Grounds project began as a side project of intellectual curiosity and teaching necessity, but has grown beyond my original expectations. And as a recently tenured faculty member at the university, I have been hyper aware of the campus history's complicated racial past, from slavery to Jim Crow exclusion to the civil rights movement. I also recognize and acknowledge the previous bold, courageous efforts of faculty like Al Brophy at the law school, Josh Rothman, who was then an untenured professor, now he's the chair of the history department, my current chair, Utes McKnight, and other UA faculty and students in pushing the university to accept its past that resulted in an apology in 2004, and for being engaged in this long struggle towards recognition and acknowledgement. I am also aware that there is more to be done at a public institution within the SCC conference. I therefore made very specific decisions on the development of this project and with tenure and see opportunities for growth. But it's those students' comments, as well as James Baldwin's quote, that informs my work. And that quote is, "To accept one's past, one's history, is not the same as drowning in it. It is learning how to use it. An invented past can never be used. It cracks and crumbles under the pressure of life like clay in a season of drought." So my brief remarks will discuss my knowledge of the literature over these debates, how I see myself engaging with digital humanities and the traditional scholarship of slavery and freedom, and how I developed this project and the research that's undergirding it, and conclude kind of with some final directions of where I'm going in the future. And I hope in this that I can provide a model for those who are seeking to do this work, because it's not easy work. Oftentimes it starts in the most random places, but if you think and use the stuff that we read about in our scholarship, in our classrooms, you can apply it. So it's how do you apply history, and how do you apply it to current debates where you are part of that community trying to shape it. Upon reaching the university, I was curious about this past. This is a picture of the university from 1859. It's one of the few earliest pictures that we have of the university. It is standing on the top of the president's mansion, and looking towards the dome building is the rotunda. And this is the campus that got destroyed for the most part on April 4th, 1865. The buildings that survived the destruction of campus, because the University of Alabama decided to not close down during the Civil War, but to train future officers to the Confederacy. Those buildings include the President's Mansion and the surviving outbuildings, Maxwell Hall, the Gorgas House, and then the little roundhouse, and then a slave cemetery. Everything else was razed. But it's this landscape, and that from point 1 there to point 3, that still exists with our current academic quad. And this is where the new campus gets built around. So everywhere you go, slavery is hidden in plain sight, as well as Jim Crow past, and where Black African Americans could not attend as students but still worked as groundsmen, to the civil rights pioneers. And it's on this same footprint, marked by that slave past, is where in 1956 a mob gathered to expel Autherine Lucy. And then that same past in 63 that Vivian Malone Jones and James Hood walked across. And it's just the same landscape pretty much I see every day. So for me, it was, how do I recognize this landscape? How do I recognize that the buildings that get rebuilt are named after people who enslaved individuals at the university? And it's that enslaved labor that is hidden in plain sight. That was one of those parts of that unsung founders that no one talked about, other than to mock at parties or to dress in blackface in other sense. And also too, but also the contradictions of having the Department of Gender and Race Studies that combines African American studies and women's studies in one department, located in a building named after the second president of the university, longest serving and most tied to the institution of slavery at the university. So I go to my office in Manley Hall, and I know Basil Manley's not happy to see my diploma from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, hanging on the wall. because he's responsible for enslaving people at the university for 2 decades. But it also got me to think about the students' comments and its relevance for discussing slavery as practice at the university and other institutions of higher ed at UA and the SEC. And it's his innocent remarks that reveal the power embedded in myths that institutions tell itself and its constituents, and reveals the way that the Lost Cause project promoted by the United Daughters of the Confederacy and other segregationists continue to shape students in the present, especially those of color. And as a scholar who's committed to amplifying the lives and experiences of ordinary Americans, especially ordinary Black men, women, and children, I wondered how might I be a part of that solution of revising these old narratives and promote newer inclusive narratives of nuanced portrayals of the enslaved. So one of the first things I did was I took a tour of the campus. So our slave cabins were called garden sheds. Sadly, we lost when talking about the Civil War and Yankee invaders. So for my student, I could not fault him for the narratives that he learned on as a prospective student and the narratives he continued to hear on the campus. So instead, I had to think about other ways to revise students whose first experience was this tour and how they could start looking differently at the campus and start to see what's around them. So the power of myths and the power of not seeing what's in front of you was my greatest obstacle. And in effect, I thought about how can an ongoing project move from historical recovery of the names and the people and the existence to one that's rigorous and responsible creativity in proposing something new for understanding the past, the campus's present, and its future. So I turned to the field I'm most comfortable with, history. And I know that the archives that I use were not designed for the questions that I usually ask of it, and that is of the positive roles of African Americans in there. So I use a lot of the archives that get their creation as the start of justifying segregation and white supremacy, from the Alabama Department of Archives and History to the Mississippi ones to Georgia and Virginia. So I'm aware of that history and that tension. And I'm also aware, too, of one of those challenges: how do you explore the history of one's employer and the surrounding local community? And this is where that archival project becomes more real and not just abstract. And one of the people I turn to often when I think about archives and teaching of archives and how do I revise an archive comes from W. Fitzhugh Brundage in Southern Past. Through decisions about the appropriate focus of archives, museums, and historical agencies, and I would include institutions like the University of Alabama, white historians and their allies effectively removed competing groups and historical alternatives from the region's past. Although couched in terms of promoting civic spirit and in case university spirit and tradition, this archival impulse in the South impeded any inclusive or democratic understanding of Southern history. The region's archives and museums reflecting the highest stage of white supremacy were for all purposes for whites only. And it's the consequences of this archival project and universities' roles in being repositories for these archives explain some of the privileges that I saw as white privilege as inevitable as consequence of history, and those who now walk that campus have to accept those terms without questioning it, and those who would accept those myths that were circulating around the university, and influencing students and people's place, how they understand the landscape, the curriculum, demographics, and race relations. So I turn to DH scholars, in particular Vincent Brown and Jessica Marie Johnson and others, because I started to think about how DH scholars were at the time starting to think about how do you expand what the archives are. And in terms of slavery and Reconstruction scholars, we were doing the same as well. How do we think about the archives for exploration In the case of digital humanities scholars, they were also concerned about not replicating the archives, the traditional archives that many of us were using and was propelling us to go digitally. And how do we create and use multidisciplinary, multidimensional methods and tools once we expand the archives, what do we do with those archives? And it's the provocations raised by several essays that really started me to think about, if I was going to do this work, it had to have a public presence and a digital presence. And that would be Tara McPherson's Why Are Digital Humanities So White? Also Moya Z. Bailey's work, All the Digital Humanists are white, all the nerds are men, but some of us are brave. And Jessica Marie Johnson's work, who I wish I was here for recently, her growing literature, including her recent Marked Up Bodies, and others that convinced me to be brave, intentional, and willing to get out of my comfort zone. Because one of the things for me is I don't like writing about slavery. I rather talk about people not as movable property, not as objects, but as people. And that built real lives and not defined by the violence of slavery or its aftermath. So for me, I like to focus on post-war, the creation of community, families, and moving away from keeping people that I uncover entrapped in this period of inhumanity. So for me, I had to be brave by getting out of my comfort zone of doing 19th century American history. I had to move back instead of moving forward. But ultimately, I knew I could not have students, especially those of color, take one of my classes without interrogating this racial past and its legacy, because they will be receiving degrees from this school. They need to know this. They need to know where they're walking. They need to understand their place and how they're continuing on building upon that legacy, but for a more inclusive campus. And at the University of Alabama, the institutional racial past of slavery, Jim Crow exclusion, and the civil rights movement, and those archival silences and silences of the landscape still affects all people who experience that campus. So from building names to the physical landscape and the built environment to traditions. Indeed, Baldwin's words continue to haunt. History is not the past, is in the present. We, meaning myself and the current UA community, carry our history. We are our history. So what did I do? I read. And these are the common books that if you go to the university and understand the experience, you'll find. And to gain legitimacy, I had to respond to how these works talked about the past. And I knew I had to convince a university community, but also a state community who proclaims as their motto, we defend our rights, but know quite well who are the we and who are the they, and the are defined by race, class, gender, ability, and historical power hierarchies. I therefore limited my research to using UA's materials. So I knew if I was going to tell UA's story about a difficult past, I had to use their resources instead of going to Duke or to UNC, because I didn't want to be labeled as a liberal outside agitator. And that still carries a lot of weight. I also had to tackle sources that these scholars didn't really talk about. They focus on Basil Manley, who's the second president of the university. His diaries, he annotates his diaries because he knew he's going to be famous. So you can go through and say slave death, birth, and note and find enslaved people. And because he served from the 1830s to 1855, he covers a large swath of the university history. So James Sellers, who wrote a book in the 50s, Al Brophy's book that is just came out from Cambridge, James Fuller, and then the recent anthology by Leslie Harris and Al Brophy and others. They really, when they talk about the University of Alabama, they talk about Basil Manley and the enslavers. When they talk about the enslaved, they talk about those who were the victim of violence during those administrations, but not their lived lives, other than the recipients of violent outbursts. So instead, I turned to the non-digitized records. I went to the faculty minutes. We had the faculty minutes from 1831 to 1854. I went to the quartermaster reports during the Civil War, where enslaved people were hired under the servant fund, and noted the names there. I also looked at all the president's records that we had on campus, but I avoided Manly's. So I talked about Garland, and I looked at Woods, and I looked at the faculty of that time period to say you can tell this story without looking at Manly. Because one of the greatest obstacles were those people, including Al Brophy, Josh Rothman, my chair, and others, who said, we already know about slavery. We know Manly. What else are you going to learn? And I'm like, I can learn a lot. And I proceeded to do so with Ancestry, digitized newspaper collections, and a lot of projects that are sponsored by the Matrix here that I also use in my work. And it's using this dark archival work, I was able to learn the names, document the names, and put that in a digital space, but also in a physical landscape by walking the campus with individuals. So I want to briefly highlight some of the people that this research undergirds and can be found on the digital humanities site of Hallowed Grounds. Ben was the first enslaved person owned by the university, and he helped with the construction of this building. And Ben was hired before the university opened. He is purchased in 1827. The university opens in 1831. So Ben is here overseeing the construction of campus. He is helping the architect. He is running and performing our jobs. He's maintaining the landscape of this building. He is not allowed to sleep in this building, though. He sleeps outside on the lower level underneath the covered patio there. And we also know Ben got sick because he had to sleep outside, because for over a year, one of the local doctors, the Drish House, which is a historic site that you can go visit and get married in Tuscaloosa, Dr. Drish took care of him during that time. But when the university opened in 1831, shortly thereafter, Ben is sold. But Ben's story doesn't mark an end to slavery, it marks the beginning. So one of the things, also person working in this building, was Moses. Moses, and this is his bill of sale for how much the university purchased him. He was purchased in the 1840s for $700. That's currently roughly $22,000 today. And he also worked in that space that Ben worked in. And in that space, as it was a dining hall, Moses got caught in the fray of many of the food fights that happened in the building, and he gets stabbed in the hand with a fork. And that hand never heals. So rather than sell him off, the university maintains him, and Moses actually helped the faculty in their research like we use graduate research assistants today. So Michael Toomey, when he did his geological tour of the state, Moses was with him in the field collecting specimens. Barnard, who I will talk about in a moment, before he became Columbia's university's president and the chancellor of Ole Miss, he was faculty at UA. And he used Moses and other enslaved people in his laboratory. But Moses, what we see and what one of the documents that's on the site is his purchase. And we know he was 28 years old. We know he was sound and healthy. And that line, he was a slave for life. But I was also able to go through and talk about a difficult subject at the University of Alabama, and that's with this mansion. And you can see some of the original outbuildings. So this one here, that is the well washroom. It's currently used as a garage. And this one over here, and I have a better picture of it, that is one of the original 2 slave quarters back there. But in this structure is where enslaved women resided, because in 1831, at the very first faculty meeting, the faculty and the early administrators decided that no female servant, UA didn't call slaves slaves, we called them servants, be permitted in entering any college buildings. And should any student be found in violation, they will be dealt with of the nature of offense permitted. Oftentimes, it means they're just apologizing for lessening their honor. So apology is what they mean by being dealt with. But where that means all the women that we have on our campus were owned by faculty or the presidents. So they are in those slave quarters. And they are also being used, in the case of Luna, to be prostituted out to the students. And Luna was owned by Barnard, future president of Columbia University. And this is the building named after him. And Barnard, who was complained about by President Manley, and the work that Al Brophy has done, I know that Luna was rented out vis-a-vis another enslaved person owned by Barnard. And that he not just only used Luna, he used other women. And Manley, according to his diary, said, quote, Barnard's male slave Morgan acted as a pimp to get out Barnard's women, especially the younger Luna, whom they use in great numbers nightly. At present, both UA and the University of Mississippi, we just have buildings named after them, but not an entire women's college like Columbia does. So it spreads wide because these faculty members went national, not just in the South. But yet, in the same time, these records that note Barnard's exploitation of Luna, they also shed light on women's resistance. Specifically, the way women like Sabra and Lydia named their children, because they named them, not Manley. And you'll see here in front of the president's mansion in the outbuildings, individuals now learn about Sabra, who was a cook in, she would have cooked here. So slave quarter, kitchen, well washroom, slave quarter. Who named her daughter, who was born on campus in 1862. They also learned of Lydia, who named her daughter Serena, who was born on Halloween, 1846, in those outer cabins. But they also learned about this young woman here, who, when my second year at the university, decided to build upon the past of Luna, once taken and learning the history in my classes, but also the professors of Manley Hall, that she was going to honor that presence by doing the Black Power salutes. But one of the downsides is now students of color cannot get any access to that building because this went viral. So one of the goals in the future is to do a spatial analysis and model it inside the president's mansion and the outbuildings so people can virtually go into a space that's now excluding them. And it's this archival work that led me to the building that gave me my first intellectual curiosity. And this is this structure. This is the guardhouse, little roundhouse. It was used during surveillance during the Civil War by those on sentry duty. And it also was a slave cabin to the drummers who represented the drum corps. And on this marker, and this is one of the things that piqued my curiosity, this is the text of the historical marker next to this site. It mentioned slaves on it. And I was like, well, who are the slaves? Who are the people? But what does it mean that the university put up a private marker, not a state marker, but a private university marker to acknowledge the slave past? So it gave me some insights and some resistance. But most people don't read it. And in doing that, I found their names. And this is from Garland's records that most people don't look at, except for what life was like for the students during the Civil War. And before the Yankee invaders, according to the tour, came down and destroyed it. And they see Neil and Gabe's name, who were hired, and Crawford, who replaces Neal. And on April 3rd, 1865, it's Gabe and Crawford who are waking up the students before federal forces come to campus. But on this structure, their names aren't listed. On this marker, their names are not listed. But also, too, this structure becomes a site of the future and the Jim Crow exclusion. This is a picture of the 1912 yearbook featuring the guardhouse. And you can see it's there. It's being used. The landscape looks completely different. But there's a mistake on this. This was not the only remaining building of the old university. There's several. Also, too, is the subject of early campus tours and early work to remember this past. But no slavery there. No names of Neal, Crawford, and Gabe there. It was used by James Anderson in a radio drama, but also the history, the lore of the old campus and the destruction of campus on April 3rd and 4th. But no names of the enslaved. So that erasure that gets perpetuated over time. And lastly, before it's a presently location of a no tailgate zone, if you know football culture, Big Ten, but SEC, they start tailgating on Friday at 8. Is now a no tailgate zone. But in 1961, this is the Alabama yearbook. The cover, the dedication, the folding flaps is a nod to the lost cause and the current problem of desegregating the campus, in which the students of 1961 promised that another war at hand would be in place, and that they stopped the foe of Arthurine Lucy from entering the university, and they vowed to continue that fight. So this site that's a slave cabin becomes a site of white resistance to desegregation. And now it's on the same level as the other commemorative sites of the Civil War and this white past. But no names of Neal, Crawford, and Gabe. So this is where Hallowed Grounds built its legacy. And I'm gonna try to move here. So one of the first iterations on the website, other than a few documents, was an Adobe Spark version of the tour. I was one person, and I usually walk the campus 6 to 8 times, but again, I'm a full professor. I teach, I'm writing, I'm doing service. I can't always walk the campus, but this is the tour, bringing in those documents, bringing in the bill of sales, and giving a narrative so people can learn on their own, but seeing the original documents that are tied to slavery at the university. They also see the legacy part of Morgan Hall, John Tyler Morgan, noted Confederate general, who sues for reparations against the federal government for the destruction of campus, also noted Klansman. And how that site that used to have his picture has a piece of art from the Paul R. Jones collection. Paul R. Jones was denied entrance to the University Law School because of his race. So instead of Morgan, you have this. So they learn about this past, and they can take it on their own, but they can use their phones in doing it. They can also learn, too, one of the advantages over time is having those documents made available. And this is, I use this as more of a pilot because I'm still trying to build it and get it in the hands of folks. But one of the greatest thing I wanted to do is make sure people said, oh, slavery's there, it's only a few people. It can't be that bad. By digitizing and analyzing those documents. By also, too, having the other thing like the bill of sale for Isaac. Because my students, because of Alabama policy, can't read cursive. But others want to know about who else was owned by the university. By having that document there and note it and be able to use it and access it and put it in their classroom projects. And also, what happened with Reconstruction. because many of the former enslaved people worked on the university as paid laborers after the Civil War, but built the early churches, the schools, and laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement. And then also the legacy by having those tours in one place. The other thing that happened, this was the revised part, this was the original space. Because one of the documents that's on this has nothing to do with the University of Alabama. It has everything to do with my alma mater of UNC Chapel Hill. So I have on here this dedication speech for Silent Sam. I've been teaching this speech since 2010. It's one of my most commonly known speeches, and this is one of the first speeches that was put on the website. And this is one of the first speeches post-Charlottesville that has gone throughout and escaped the campus. So when Silent Sam came down in August of last year, I had 62,000 folks visit this site. And then they went to UA. And they taught lessons based on my impulse to have teachable documents up online, to have broader conversations. And the Sellers book that talked about slavery, but Al Brophy's and Leslie Harris's new book even cites it. It's part of now engaged literature. The power and impact from the words of a student to where it has grown. But it has allowed me to do more, and to think about space, and to think about the impact and why this early DH forays helped. Because I was able to do something that I wanted in the first, change conversations, get students to know their history more, and to not accept the narratives that were being told. I wanted to correct those narratives. So while on-campus tours are still being done, online ones are done too. So the online version is used in multiple classrooms currently, is connected to the Bicentennial of Alabama. People who can't come to Tuscaloosa have used it, and I know other college campuses who are doing this history are now using this for a quick and easy accessible tour. To get that information out there and then building upon it. One thing I want to do is I'm all about access. And people who physically can't maneuver the campus. An audio version will be there, so it'll be linked to sites, so you'll have the documents and a map with embedded audio. I don't map, but we have a map center that does, so recording that audio and linking. So thinking about scale and access is really key. But also, too, building visualizations like this that takes all the names and the number of times they appear in the records, and see unknown being the number one name there. Who are those unknown, and eliminate those silences, but Moses, Ned, Jack, Sam, Isaac, Anderson, and giving people other names to learn. That now I have students in my classroom, when they do these tours and they do these assignments, I'm like, well, how can you honor Moses in the present? What can the university do to remember this name? And they have created art pieces and other creative solutions. So they're not saying to my class now, but Dr. Green, slavery did not exist. Now they're like, what happened to Moses? Where is his descendants? What does this matter? They're looking at Georgetown. They're looking at other sites, and they want to know more. And they want to know who in the community is those descendants, and how can they improve better relationships between the university and the town. I also was able to teach a class. And public history is a part of the thing. So my student projects, their projects are online as well. I always have a component in there. You will be sharing your knowledge to outside of this classroom space. And final products will be put on the website, having classes build content so we can get the knowledge out. So in this course on slavery at the University of Alabama and its legacy, 13 students, only one history major. I had 5 engineers, 3 other social science, largely political science, but I had 5 engineers in this class. They took a campus-long course and dived into history because they wanted to know their campus. And they created a pop-up museum that had over 200 attendees in 2 hours. The final product is online on their Adobe Spark version and a PDF for those who are not comfortable with Adobe Spark. The syllabus for that course is online because people are like, how could I bring this to our campus? So the website now, I teach through the website, teach through documents, I'm always adding. And by doing that and making it visible, you see also too, hashtag activism. Slavery, UA, and then the latest iteration for my students. We're like, we need to say their names, Dr. Green. People need to know their names. And that latter one came from my students in that class that did the pop-up museum. And so anytime in that tweeting and hashtagging out, they are also pressuring the university to do more. And that work has helped because along the way I've been building allies, building collaborators along the way, and being able to think about how do I take this smaller project and make it accessible, build an audience that anyone who wants to know this can look at UA and link it to Princeton, link it to Harvard, and compare across the universities, because this was a national problem and an international problem, not just a Southern problem. And by doing that, the University of Alabama did something that, again, not expected. Last October, they created a commission for studying and understanding its slave past and its legacy. DH can work if you build it in a right way. And you build stakeholders and collaborators and start small and expand. But the biggest thing is, with expansion, is money, will, and community stakeholders. Because if the UA community wasn't involved, this project probably was stopped and disappeared in the ether of the web. So a student who says, but Dr. Green, slavery did not exist at the university, built a full-fledged project that now includes walk-in tours, curriculum design, possible teaching aspects, and the documents for inclusion. And its impact is huge because this is me on one tour. You know, this is not your traditional students in there. There's faculty in that tour. There's a person from UA Press. There are some grad students in there. And these are largely English MFA students. But I walk in October, which this is, but I also walk in August. If anyone experienced Alabama in August, and triple-digit heat is the norm, one of the things that the in-person tours do is the experience of weather and sensory. We are all sweating as we're learning about slavery at UA and experiencing that life. But audio tours will be there because I'm one person and I want people to access this when I'm not around as well and get it embedded in the infrastructure. Traditional scholarship, I am working on some projects, traditional papers, because DH projects are not always recognized as scholarship at institutions. So by doing something that's legible to my institution for promotion and the like is one thing. DH and try to change that conversation that projects like this, once they're multidimensional and disciplinary, actually count. So collaboration. CARI is a collaborative art research initiative. I don't code. I will say this. I don't code. I know my limitations. I don't do ArcGIS either. But I have people who want to work with me in developing that map of the university and connect, not only mapping the enslaved people who come from South Carolina, Mississippi, and Georgia to the university campus, but mapping freedom and Reconstruction, because a lot of the enslaved people who worked there were rented out on the hiring out system. What communities did they build during Reconstruction? And how did that legacy continue on? So what was UA's impact, not only with development of slavery and capitalism, but also the Reconstruction and freedom and Black Reconstruction? What does that look like? What does that look like spatially? So using things like the last scene and the information wanted ads, tracking people in Texas who worked at UA, people who moved to Indianapolis and died in Indianapolis but worked at UA during slavery. Where did those pathways go, and understanding that legacy? The other thing is, too, to look at augmented reality. So why I like this picture a lot, they are standing on the edge of the quad. One of the most common jobs enslaved people did, and they're under the category of unknown, was to cut the lawn using hand scythes. 15 to 20 men and boys twice a month in the heat. They also carried water from the main water source of Mars Spring to every single building campus. They also toted wood and other things as common chores. Using augmented reality, and the dance department wants to do a dance with that reality to show that labor being done. So as you're going through, you can recreate those other people that worked at that space that some people are doing frisbees, they're sitting on the quad, but think about the other people who were also at that space. Applying for grants, because projects like this need funding. But more importantly, I really take serious the work of Vincent Brown, Simon Newman's Hidden in Plain Sight project, and other works that Jessica Marie Johnson want and do. How can I create and using people around me who are interested in telling the full story of Alabama in a collaborative, multi-dimensional, including sound, music, what type of books that they're reading, spatial analysis. And that means interdisciplinary across the humanities, but also the sciences. And ultimately create a sustainable project that will survive me and move forward. So the future of UA, students and visitors won't say slavery did not exist. They're like, we know it exists, so who were they? And what did they do to build upon the foundation that we're enjoying now? So why DH matters. We need scholarship that's not behind paywalls, because our scholarship must engage a community that doesn't include your traditional college campuses and are largely K through 12 and homeschool parents, and those who are increasingly Black, brown, and other, who want to know this history to get a sense of themselves, and in particular, the descendant communities, and are trying to find their place in the complications of memory, in which the University of Alabama played a role in. And it should not be limited to just the enslavers who have building names, or the civil rights pioneers that crossed the campus. We just named a building named after John England. Judge John England was one of the first African Americans to enroll in the law school. UA has been adding new names, but keeping the old, so complicating the legacy that way. But it tends to be pioneers and not the everyday people. So bringing them in. Because we need to think about those descendants of these people. These are names of the enslaved people I unearthed in my research. And this was a print of the slave quarters in the President's Mansion that was handed out this last summer during orientation at the University of Alabama. It was a free print. And for 2 weeks, I watched parents, especially Black parents, face completely change when they saw the slave quarters here. And instead, I'm like, let me make an art piece out of that and remind myself why I'm still doing this work. And it's why it's on the website, as you could see, to remind people who want to know these names, but also, too, bridging where I'm at. So one of the things I told about earlier, I'm not comfortable talking about slavery, I'd rather talk about freedom. So one of the things that I did early on was try to figure out who were the individuals who continued on under freedom and what happened to them. So with freedom, you get last names. With last names, you have Ancestry, Family Search, digital newspapers, and all those tools. And I'm now able to know, with student help, but also too, an insistence that I'm not keeping individuals enslaved, talk about that last few years of what happened to them. Jeremiah Barnes, he was owned by Washington Moody. He worked briefly at the university as an enslaved person and then as a Mason after the Civil War. before becoming a school teacher in the Tuscaloosa schools. And he taught in those schools until 1918. As I like to tell my students in Southern Black education history, he stole his education from UA and then taught others. He was also a Mason, a Prince Hall Mason, and an accomplished choir director. He was a long-term leader of the Black community during Reconstruction. Claiborne Garland, who was owned by President Garland, was a paid employee who also operated a private school to train teachers. That school that he used to train teachers was a former plantation house that he was able to purchase with his wages as a paid employee from the University of Alabama. Cornelius Garland became a paid employee of the university. He was a member of the African American Republican Party after Reconstruction who appeared on a blacklist, calling for his assassination because he dared to defy the racial norms and hierarchies reestablishing. And if you ever watched the recent episode of Who Do You Think You Are with Regina King, her descendant, Moses Hughes, that was featured in that, worked alongside Cornelius and Claiborne Garland. Cornelius, instead of being thrown in jail or killed for his activism, the simple act of an apology saved his life, and he dies in 1910s in Birmingham, Alabama. Bridging that legacy by thinking about not the university who enslaved, and then emancipation's over, everything's all good because slavery's not there, but looking after what are the afterlives of those individuals and how they laid groundwork for the civil rights movement gains that the university commemorates. And by having this was a pop-up museum that was done for this Black History Month. It will be online because I already had requests from K through 12 teachers to ask for this information. Saying their names, learning this history, having those difficult conversations, and the use of DH to facilitate those is why I continue to do my work. So I want to thank you for coming out today and learning these names. And as I implore you, as you deal and look at the University of Alabama, but also your own campus's history, think about those names that are hidden in plain sight, those people who work there, and how DH can help amplify and change narratives. Thank you. Yes. All right, I see a question.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I was curious, how do students, hopefully this isn't too technical, but
Yeah.
how do students actively engage with this project and the creation?
So one of the things students engage with, especially with the initial part, I did a lot of the heavy lifting. But now one of the things that happens, because I teach this material a lot, students are like, Dr. Green, I found the document. I think this will be good. Can we do gender and women? We need to have Sabra's story up here. And they are finding the documents and putting it out there. And also master students in gender and race studies. We have a women's studies master's program using graduate students that way and helping with the transcriptions of the documents, the presentation, but also the future growth of the project. So one of the things I want to do next, another why I need grant money, is tours. University of Alabama doesn't want to pay graduate students or students to give the tours, and I refuse to have unpaid labor, largely students of color, talking about slavery and its legacy, unpaid. So trying to get there, but I think because I'll be coming up on a sabbatical, students will be doing those tours. But I want that as a permanent research line, so working towards that. So they are going to be the digitization of a lot of these documents, because a lot of them aren't digitized yet. Working with the library. And so students, especially grad students, are at the future. And they are the ones too, my current students are the ones who are asking, I know you have this, can you make sure, can you put this up here? Can I use this? Dr. Green, this link is here, my mom wants to come. Can I use this link on? That's how they are. But they are my ambassadors to get that larger stakeholder. But I want more of a role, but I want it funded, that they're not exploited labor, especially with talking with slavery. We need funded.
Hi, absolutely amazing talk. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering more about the technical aspects of how the archives you're building relate to the official archives of the university.
Yeah.
You know, and in some ways, I mean, what you're doing is so incredibly important. But if we end up just layering that on top of the UA archives, it tends to hide this systematic forgetting.
Yes.
You know, and so how exactly are your archives relating to the official?
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges with why the grants are going to be, I want to do a site within a site because the main archivist, Kate Matheny, who honestly, if it wasn't for the archival relationship I had with her, I wouldn't have had unfettered access to some of these documents, like the faculty minutes. It was, yeah, we had this document here. I'm not sure what's in there, but this will help. But they don't really know what they have. The finding aids don't identify. So one of the things that happened early on, once I identified that something with slavery is there, I can email her and she updates the finding aid. But one of the things is too, when the digitization project happens, because they're underfunded as well, knowing, working with her, I can help get the students and get that transcriptions up and having that layered. But the burial part in there is the big concern, because right now, Manly's diaries are available online digitally, but they're not transcribed and they're not tagged. So they are literally hidden in digital site. And trying to make that visible. So it's been relationship building with the archives, and then thinking about a project that is not buried, but tangential and linked off of there. So the main goal is to have it linked, arts and humanities, because I'm within that college, have it linked directly there, and on the library site if you want to do this work. But also development of a finding aid for anyone who wants to do any university history on race. And having some of the work that I've been doing and the students been doing, and having that as a student project within the libraries so it doesn't get buried. Because the burial part, oftentimes I'm one of the first persons to use these materials in decades. But because I know how to find people of color in the early thing and use those tools, most people just give up. So it can get buried really quickly under institutional barriers. So for me, trying to amplify and link to the library stuff from here gets them curious. But we have a system for digital humanities that's in transition, and it's not a Mecca-based system. So if you click on a link that's linked to the library, it might appear as a white screen because it's fallen apart. So once it gets to a more stable platform, I'm always hyperlinking to the digital that's there, and oftentimes the apparatus that they have currently for it is not supportive. So that transcriptions and links still happen, but only if they work, and I have that relationship. All right, I see a question percolating over here. Yes. Hey.
So I'm interested in the ways in which the campus administration is responding to actively marking the campus in a non-digital way. I mean, I love the idea of augmented reality to re-people the landscape, but are the markers going to change?
That is a good question. Yes and no. I will say this, markers usually come on, get erected on that campus because of activism. So 2004, Al Brophy, Utes McKnight, Josh Rothman, and grad students in the law school pushed for the apology of the University of Alabama 2006, a marker went up. Then nothing. Just got a marker to authoring Lucy Foster. That was a fight. But that was done through the School of Ed on the land that they control, using their school's money to put up a marker to her. So new markers, harder to put up because then all the backlash comes like, is this necessary? What's the history? What's the text? But the digital with the linked map that they have in the historical markers, that has been the avenue that they are looking at and possibly developing because it's based on tourism. Those who want to know can know. So for me, I take it incremental steps. I get this, let's ask for the next and keep on going. But one of the things that was a challenge in the administration is I was deeply afraid the first couple of years of the tours getting shut down and my work being stopped in the archives and barriers being put in place and the building of a DH site used in there. So I was always like, okay, what can I put up? What can I not put up? How can I do this? And being methodical there. And when the provost supported it, I'm like, oh, I can actually put more documents up now. So I don't have to worry about that fear. And this is where the students come into play. Because they started asking their professors and the administration, why don't we have this on Bama Bound? Why don't we have this? Why do we have to learn about it here? And then alumni, why are we not being told this story? You had to go across different levels. And so now it's at the point where scalability is up, but the marker of the landscape is always going to be a fight in there. So I'll start with the digital and then hopefully get the private markers up. But I will say students are not accepting that they are fighting. And this is where hashtag activism matters. Morgan Hall, John Tyler Morgan, there's a whole bunch of campaigns every year, rename Morgan. Knott Hall, Josiah C. Knott, eugenicists, Tights of Mankind, the home of the Honors College, they are always fighting. Like, we don't want this building named after this individual. And as you come in, learn about the real Knott, as they call it. And that has helped in a different set of conversations, but the university is looking at adding new buildings and using its building to change that way, slowly adding markers. But to have a building named after John England is huge. Because other than authoring Lucy Foster, which is a marker, we have the clock tower to her. This is the first building named after an African American. And I'm like, okay, it wasn't the person I thought it was going to be, but having that on top of Manly and others, I think that's going to say a bigger message. So I'll know from what we can do from there. And I'll be curious of what that internal marker is going to say for that building.
Hi, Dr. Green.
Hello. I'm so happy to see Bree.
So to kind of piggyback off of that question, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ways that the university, in broader terms, supports this project, but also deals with the undercurrent of current racial tensions on the campus and how they kind of moderate the two.
Yeah, every year we have a racial incident. So one of the things today, we have a controversial speaker speaking on the campus. Ben Shapiro is at UA today. And it was also a day that there was a walk-in tour of authoring Lucy Foster. So we have this conversation on one way, but a whole nother set of conversations on the other. But one of the things that doing this work has helped is one of the first times I'm actually able to get people who are the non-traditional UA individuals who purposely don't take my classes to learn the history and become invested in a way. So it is a problem and an attention, and I think that's the other reason why the university really much tolerates and is putting money and funding in here is because they're trying to balance the brand. And they're trying to balance the student population that goes off to SPLC, EGI, doing social justice work with the other students there, and how to bridge the campus that they haven't quite reconciled with its slave past, its Jim Crow past, or its civil rights past. So they're using this as an opportunity to start facilitating the conversations. But it also, this is where the impact comes into play. They'll fund security for those events, but not fund a grad student or undergrad to do tours. So it's that constant balance work and always shaping. So for me, the fact I'm continuing to build and thinking about collaborations and partnerships across campus, off of campus, but more importantly within the SCC. Because in Alabama, it doesn't matter unless you're in a SCC conference. And when Mississippi came up with their commission, first thing they said, well, Alabama might apologize first, but we got a commission first. And that changed the dialogue on our campus. Auburn is starting their work. They're like, Mississippi got this, Alabama got this, why don't we have this? Harnessing the power of this past, but harnessing the SCC. And I think one of the best things that happened this last year, and why this project also is going to escalate more, I had Damian Harris in my Intro to AFAM Studies class. UA powerhouse will make more money than me in my lifetime. Great students. He wrote a reflection paper, what the university should do with its enslaved past. And he suggested in the football stadium that they're rebuilding to name one of the box seats after William the Carpenter and put all the documents about William to remind them of their unpaid labor on the field with the labor that he did. And when you have someone who's going to go to the NFL and possibly come back and donate money, say that and write that as part of his assignment and develop a 5-page paper on. Those are the minds I'd rather change and work towards, and those are building. But that tension's never going to go away.
Can you discuss a bit digital humanity projects that have influenced you and kind of situate your project within the Black digital humanities and what that all means?
Yeah, so some projects that really inspired me are some classics. So The Valley of the Shadow that Ed Ayers did. That was one of the first, and documented the American South. So it was one of the first 2 DH projects that I'm like, oh wait, digital humanities actually works. And for Ed Ayers' project, my mother's family's from Franklin County, Pennsylvania since 1820 as free people of color, and they still live there. That was the first time that I saw a project talk about what I heard all the time on family portraits of the stolen ones. Free African Americans who were taken during Gettysburg and enslaved. So Ed Ayers' project and what he did and the clunkiness of it, but the documents underneath, I'm like, oh, I could have transcriptions of documents there and have it in an easy site, try to navigate. So some of those categories. But documenting the American South, I taught at HBCU before coming to Alabama, where our library budget was cut to 0. So we didn't have JSTOR. We didn't have any of the databases. And I had to teach students who were history majors. So documenting the American South and other projects like that helped me overcome the limitations of the library. And a lot of them incurred. One of my former students is now in a PhD program at Mississippi State about to do comps. But that's where I'm like, okay, non-paywall ones, I need this. The people in the communities, I need this. So the issue of not having a database that you can afford impacted me and continues to impact people. So the design to make sure it was free, easy to find, use the sources there and build and listen to the community and what they request really came in. But in terms of other Black digital humanities, what I really have been looking at is the work that's been done by slavery scholars and the mapping out of Virginia and Virginia Commonwealth and others, because that gave me inspiration. I'm like, oh, wait, we can follow people over space. The runaway ads, the last scene, those small little documents that I saw all the time that try to find people. So I can use this and connect it with this site to see if they reunited with a person and building across. So asking the questions, okay, we know they're enslaved. What happened next? Scaffolds in many databases have been my tool. And I'm like, okay, how can this tool link to this site and this site? And where else could I link through? That can be taught and recommended. If you're doing this, look at this too, and it's suggested. So it goes back to recovery, amplification, and then in my scholarship, using those DH sites, including in this next book, Family Search. So I told you my mom's from Pennsylvania, and I heard about the stolen ones. And I always asked, did anyone come back? And she's like, well, I'm not sure, but none of us were taken. Using Family Search and the Freedmen's Bureau records and the court records there and the black newspapers, I was able to track a mother who reclaimed 2 of her children. I would not have been able to do that 10 years ago. So it's what Jessica Marie Johnson and Vincent Brown talk about. We need to build this, but also then use it in our scholarship to form deeper and newer stories. And I think that's why I've gotten a lot from Black DH humanities scholars. It's not just building the source, it's using the source to have fresh perspectives of old topics. And that is where I constantly see, like, how can we tell the story differently in fresh ways, but bring the people who were marginalized to the fore. Yes.
Hi, I also went to UNC, and so I'm wondering, like, can you discuss more about the debate about removal of certain honors on campus versus adding contests versus renaming versus adding different monuments and stuff like that?
Yes, all right, so I will say where I was before it became personal, and not just the university abstracting communities. So I worked with monuments and communities dealing with monuments. So I usually think about 4 ways. It's a community, it depends on the community. So adding new, I'm like, okay, if this is a community like Elizabeth City, North Carolina, where I taught, it had unionists, conscientious objectors, African Americans who formed the largest contingent of USCT soldiers, Confederate guerrillas, and then Confederate soldiers, but unionists and black soldiers were the dominant ones. And they all used that space after the Civil War for memory. But currently, there's only one monument there, and that was the Confederate monument. So I'm like, okay, we know this history, we know everyone used it. Best thing is balance it out and create a true Civil War plaza. But when the county commissioner said, nope, and told the black community, and this is a direct quote, you need to get over it, and close down conversation, I'm like, well, no one has a monument now. Just removed at this point. And what has happened since that closing down the conversation, vandalism has increased at that site. And if you're familiar with North Carolina and monuments, this is not new. There's one community in which a person constantly steals a car. Once it gets put up, back up, runs it over with a stolen car. It gets destroyed, it gets rebuilt, it gets put up. Within 72 hours, it's run down again. So someone doesn't like that monument. So for me, it's listen to the community and the values of the present. So adding new is one thing, depending on the circumstances. Reinterpretation, I'm in a building named after Basil Manley. Gender and race studies in a building named after a man who gave the opening prayer for Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy as inauguration, who oversaw the largest years of slavery at the university. And then on our second floor is religious studies, none of whom study Southern Baptist history. In fact, they study religions Basil Manley would not even seen as legitimate. And they feed the squirrels upstairs, they name them Basils. And everyone in that quad represents Civil War memory in the slave past. We always tell the people there, like, you know where you're walking in? This is Manly Hall. Let's talk about Manly and why having us in this space and occupying the space matters. So that's where I see the reinterpretation part. The other is removal. And this is where knowing UA's campus helps. The UDC marker, we have 2 UDC monuments on our campus. A big boulder that is in its 2nd location and leveled to the ground. So it's already been moved and reinterpreted. And we have a Tiffany stained glass window that has been removed and put in its 3rd location, about to have a 4th location. So when I get like, oh, you're erasing history, I'm like, well, you're erasing the history of the enslaved people already and the African-American contributions. And monuments aren't a great way to tell history. And this has already been moved. So knowing that back and forth. But removal. Anything tied to post-war violence, Klansmen in particular, grand dragons of the Klansmen that we have, people who assassinated or called for the assassination of individuals, that rhetorical violence, they form the basis of what we call in military history the new terrorist studies. They don't need to have a building named after them. So for me, those buildings like Knott Hall, Morgan Hall, I'm like, no, you can go. We got some new names. In Morgan Hall, students tried to name after Harper Lee. Because Harper Lee not only went to UA, she attended classes in that building. That got shot down by our board of trustees. Knott Hall, Josiah C. Knott. Someone recommended General Wager Swain, because Wager Swain dealt with Knott when he Knott became the president of the medical college in Mobile. After the Civil War, that became a school for African-American children. And Knott appealed to Swain to get the school removed back into white hands and away from black children. Wager Swain decided no and actually brokered a sale, and that school existed up until the 1960s. So I'm like, okay, this is a person who interacted with Knott, did something positive in terms of black education. Might be better to have that. That got shot down. So one of the things I always say, it's going to be a community-based solution. Which things are you going to fight for? How do you fight for? And you take those little gains. But one of the things that has come consistently is the education piece. And especially seeing, it was called the Why Not movement. So why not Hall? They went on one of the tours. Didn't know, then they're like, no, we're going to fight for this. The Tuscaloosa City Task Force on Civil Rights, 3 of the members went on the tour, and then I'm involved in the project to mark that civil rights pass and connect it. So one of the things I started thinking about, okay, we do this, we get this, can we chip away on this side? And that slow, methodical chipping away. But other communities, if it's someone who is basically a terrorist or a Klansman, is that the values that the university wants to protect in the present? So Silent Sam, and I'll do a personal note on Silent Sam, because UNC. When Silent Sam came down, I watched it live in Tuscaloosa. And then I started seeing my Twitter feed blow up, because they're retweeting. And this is my first, this had my 1-year anniversary on Twitter, so I'm new to this stuff. I was up to 2 o'clock in the morning because I got interviewed by all these news outlets because of that. But it was the weekend in which the neo-Confederates came and invaded the campus, and I watched online an individual draped in the Confederate flag walk up and punch a current day student in the face. And the police did nothing. They sat around. Is I wrote a letter to then Chancellor Folt and the Board of Governors, in which I used Carr's speech. I'm like, I will not be that horsewhip Negro wench that Carr spoke about. Instead, I'm going to use my education, DH, and others to change this narrative. And what happened since that, the proposed $5.3 million home for Sam, And then Chancellor's resignation and the board coming in and then stripping her of that time. So it went from a couple months to 2 weeks to the subsequent interim chancellors. Sam probably will not go up. So when I go to UNC in 2 weeks, I'm going to stand where Sam stood. Because as a student, I never walked by Sam. Now I'm going to walk and stand where he once stood. So this is where removal and the implications for the present really matters, and who's belong, whose university. And I think about my students who now can't take their Black Power salute in front of the slave quarters. They have other places where they go and say, I am the new UA. And that, I think, is the power. But removal, Sam became a site of violence. He can't remove. No, but honestly, it was the violence afterwards. Charlottesville changed everything. And for me, once it becomes a site of violence, I'm like, there's no other way. You can't keep it at that point. And yeah, so Sam. But on my campus, nothing about the monuments. But instead, they're like, we want the slave past, doctor. So completely different. So it's community to community.